So, welcome everyone to Food for Thought, our third episode. It's been a bumpy road to start off today.
It is. We had a couple of technical difficulties, but we made it
welcome
here.
Welcome everyone to Food for Thought, our third episode. It's been a bumpy road to start off. Okay, this is still a bumpy road. So we heard some echoing from YouTube because we switched to YouTube on a brief note, as Facebook apparently has some technical difficulties with Facebook Live. So we tried two different tools and none of them worked. But
the format stays as it is. It's a weekly free format where we get together with former TEDx Vienna speakers to discuss current affairs over virtual dinners. So we are already prepared. We prepared dinner for us because today we will talk about climate change. We have a very special guest with us. So today on the menu, we do have Cameron Hepburn, who will talk about how a virus maybe can heal our entire planet.
Or not, but we'll let him tell you more about it. Cameron has been a speaker at TEDx Vienna in the previous year at TEDx Vienna About Time, where he told us about runaway solutions to climate change. A huge topic for everyone else, for everyone on the planet, and a topic that has been maybe pushed to the back due to the current crisis. So Cameron is also a professor at Oxford University. He's an environmental economist. Welcome to the show, Cameron.
Thanks very much, Vlad. Hi, guys. How are you both?
Hey, Cameron. Great to see you. Thanks for joining.
We're doing well. I mean, it's been like 20 minutes until putting everything together, but yeah, now we're live.
Before we get started with the questions that we have prepared for you, we'd like to remind our viewers and our audience that this format, even though it happens on YouTube, it works exactly the same like on Facebook. So whenever you have a question or a comment to us or to Cameron, feel free to enter it on the comment section below, because our co-host Reka will regularly join our call and share your questions with us here.
That's true. So Cameron, how are you holding up, first of all?
Not too bad. I mean, we're all learning new ways of living life, aren't we? Including getting live streaming to work, but well done. No, Oxford's gone into kind of extreme overdrive, actually. You would have thought that those of us working on climate change could get a bit of a rest, but it's not to be. Everybody's working flat out, whether it's the medics working on vaccines or others, and in my team working on the relationship between temperature and the virus spreading, or in my case, along with a great team of people working on how we might make sure that we get out of this problem that we're in while protecting the virus, protecting the economy and managing the virus. So it's all systems go.
Yeah. I can only imagine. I mean, the fact that we're in lockdown doesn't necessarily make it less work. In many cases, it takes additional effort to adapt to remote work, adapt personally to the seclusion. So yeah, but you. Sorry, got something in the throat, and that's a downside of having this call over dinner. So you said you're working on, particularly in your team, you're looking at how climate and the virus, or how climate affects the virus. Would you like to tell us more about that?
Well, there are actually lots of connections between these two issues. I mean, the COVID-19 emergency feels more urgent than the climate emergency, but they're interrelated in a lot of ways. And some of those ways are very direct. I mean, as temperatures warm, you will expect greater opportunity for vectors of disease to be functional. So, you know, there's some expectation within the scientific community that we might have more of these sorts of viruses. Remains to be seen, but that's something that looks plausible. And then there's a question about how not so much climate, but how temperature variations affect the ability of the virus to live and to spread. And there's been some very limited work on that so far, done very quickly. And I'm proud of the group in my team here and across Oxford who have done some really rapid work on this to try and understand likely spread. It's not as if temperature is going to solve the problem. I mean, the message here isn't that you can't just sit back and wait for the season to change. It's a public health emergency and we've got to do what we can. But knowing how these relationships work might mean that we can work out where the really urgent areas of attention focus are.
That's super interesting.
Yeah. So let me ask a question directly on that. So there's a lot of misinformation, right, regarding this link between the climate crisis, the coronavirus crisis, and there are so many numbers out there regarding carbon emission going back, quality of air going up. Could you give us like an outline of the current landscape, the current numbers that we should know about?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the virus has massively affected economic activity. I mean, more importantly than that, it's killing people clearly. And with economic activity, at the moment at least, is associated fossil fuel use. So as economic activity falls, pollution falls. And you can see this in the data. In fact, I might even risk sharing a screen here for you, seeing.
Yeah, let's risk that.
Let's give it a try.
Let's risk that. What could possibly go wrong? So I don't know if you can see this, but this slide shows you coal use in China, courtesy of various people, but including Carbon Brief. And the red line there is the 2020 coal use. And it's showing coal use before and after the Chinese New Year, because you can see that it normally falls before Chinese New Year, but it's taken a fair while to come back up in China. At the lowest point, we're some kind of over a quarter below, and that coal is being used for for manufacturing and industrial output. I mean, another measure of the impact of the virus on the environment is on oil use for transportation. Here, courtesy of the FT, Financial Times, some charts just looking at how the virus has stopped people moving around. So this is a measure of traffic congestion in a bunch of different cities. You see Paris, Rome, Madrid, etc., where the usual activity there is in the grey, and the the previous 7 days as of April the 2nd is in red. So you can see in many cities a really dramatic reduction in transport. And so what these effects are doing is obviously reducing pollution considerably. But it's not as if it's solving climate change, and this is not how we want to solve climate change. I mean, these are short-run effects. As soon as we sort out the virus, they'll go back to usual unless we take some action. So that's again one of the big things that one of the teams here at Oxford is working on. How do we recover from the virus, and ideally leave us in a position that's no worse in relation to climate change, possibly even a bit better.
Okay, so main takeaway, I mean, the graphs are, like, the information on the graphs is stunning, by the way. New York, you just see like a red line in comparison to the previous activity. So is the takeaway here, what actually many experts also claim, is that the decrease in pollution will not automatically lead to slowing down climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the short run, you get this little dip in greenhouse gas emissions, but the climate problem is not it's not what we call a flow problem, it's a stock problem. What I mean by that is the warming on Earth is a bit like the water level in your bath. Just think about it that way. And if you want to stop the water level from rising, you got to turn the tap off or pull the plug out. And so what we've seen now, it's not as if we've even turned the taps off, we've just turned the taps down a bit. So the flow of water going into the bath has has reduced a bit, but the bath is still actually filling up. So, it's not until we turn the tap fully off and, start to pull the plug out, or some combination of those two things, that we really start to address climate change. So, expectations are that CO2 emissions probably this year will decline on last year, in large measure due to the virus, but it's not a decline isn't zero, and we've got to get those emissions to net zero.
Right. So we're going to focus on the sustainability of measures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So maybe that's only my subjective observation, but what I've experienced while scrolling on social media and oftentimes even reading the news, I've come across many very hopeful and optimistic postings, tweets, blogs, claiming that, for example, the water quality in Venice has improved so dramatically that dolphins have crossed the channels, and flora and fauna is basically living up. And if you take a closer look to those news, they're obviously fake news. There's been a lot of really great pieces of the by the National Geographic on that. But what is your take on it? Why do you think so many people grasp on that hope that we might be isolated in our homes, but nature is basically healing and recovering on its own out there?
It's reclaiming territory.
Well, we are hardwired to look for the positive, aren't we? Many of us. It's a wonderful thing. And, it would be nice if somehow, as the title of this discussion goes, the virus is kind of healing the planet. But it's not as simple as that. Humans are not something that stands outside of nature. We're part of nature too. We're another species. And it's also not as if there's some kind of idealized, pristine version of nature that exists without humans in it. We're another species with our own waste products and with our own problems. And so the challenge for us is to find a way of us living in harmony with other species in a way that keeps us alive and healthy and prosperous. And frankly, killing people is not the way to do that. What we're about when we focus on climate change is delivering a better world for humanity and for other species. This is not the better world that those of us working on climate change want. So the fact there's a kind of a bit of a short side effect of the air being cleaner and water being cleaner, it's not really something to celebrate. We would like to achieve those things and maintain the prosperity and the freedoms that we value.
Mm-hmm. But so Cameron, is it the first time that this happens? Or do we have any other points in history that we could use as a comparison to pandemics kind of impacting or not impacting the quality of our climate?
Yeah, in recent times, obviously, we've had SARS and MERS, similar respiratory diseases, had Ebola in Africa. They were nowhere near as big as this. This is global. It's delivered, economic shutdowns on a really severe scale. I think, actually, this may be the biggest in history. You'd have to go back a very long way. And by the time you did, past the Spanish flu of 1918 into, some work done by academics in Munich and others that look at the impact of, the Black Death, of smallpox, etc. And it looks like that does come up in the figures in kind of the concentration of CO2 in ice bubbles, in bubbles of air in ice cores. But that's probably as much a function of just killing people and it won't be as big as the effects today, because what we're seeing is we are emitting an enormous amount today compared with in the past, and we've just shut a big chunk of it down. So this is big.
Yeah. So I think like the narrative until last year in terms of common threat, right? We were battling this common threat called climate change and are still doing it right now, has been taken over by the more sort of prescient threat of COVID-19, which is it's imminent, right?
Yeah.
And climate change is like a few years down the road. It's always not quite there, although it's still happening, although it's already happening, and the effects are there. Not something that happens at a specific time and place and time. But we were wondering, like, there were a lot of movements and investment in climate change and in renewable energies. Does the investment in COVID vaccines and treatment and research do mean like a lockdown in green energy research and climate change policy making? Is that in any way related?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think there's any reason we can't do these two things at the same time. And if that's what you mean. So, you know, for a while, there used to be this really bizarre debate between people as to whether it was more economically sensible to invest in preventing malaria or in addressing climate change. And, you know, I just say, why the or? I mean, is it more beneficial for me to eat my dinner or, you know, work on climate change or play some piano or see my friends? I mean, I can do all of those things and do. And so these are false dichotomies. And if you compare anything to solving malaria and saving millions of lives, it all looks bad. I mean, you compare anything to, you know, launching a war in the Middle East and everything looks good. So I think these kind of comparisons are false. So we should, you know, invest effort in getting vaccines to sort out this virus and invest effort in addressing climate change. And happily, you know, maybe we'll come on to this, but some of the ways in which we need to move on climate will actually probably help us recover from the economic damage from the virus.
So I think that before we dig a bit deeper into the economic and financial aspects of the conversation, it's about time to have Reka join us, because we just got the text that the first questions are coming in from our viewers. So let's have Reka join us.
Welcome, Reka.
Hi, guys. Hi, Cameron.
How are you?
Good. How are you? It's so great to see you. And thank you so much for joining us today and just, you know, giving more insights into this crazy times. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And before we actually move to the questions posted, I would love to follow up on what you just said of, you know, it's not an either or. We had, if you remember, we had a call with the other speakers of last year's TEDx Vienna event. And our speaker, Franziska from Fridays for Future, mentioned that, you know, they had this momentum and people were finally listening to the topics of climate change, and there needs to be a change happening. And now they feel like they kind of lost that. So how do you feel? How can they regain, how can climate change as a topic, if I may put it that way, regain this momentum that it had?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that's right. I mean, the momentum has been lost very visibly just yesterday or the day before. The UK's and Italian COP26 has been postponed. It was going to be the big conference 5 years after Paris, the end of the year, and it still will be. But it's been pushed back to summer of next year. And I think that's right. That's a good decision. You know, these things happen. I mean, emergencies happen and you have to adjust. And in a sense, you know, if I think back to TEDx Vienna, where we were talking about complex adaptive dynamic systems and how small changes can have big impacts. I mean, this virus is a classic example of that. You know, you get a bat and a pangolin in Wuhan and, you know, 3 months later, the whole planet's shut down. So, you know, it's a reminder of just how interconnected we are. And that relates to climate too. So we will come back to climate, you know, no mistake, make no mistake, it's key. And, you know, certainly my colleagues at Oxford who work on climate, as I say, we're as busy as ever, because when you have these big disruptive moments, you know, all your assumptions go up in the air and you can start to question things. And we know that there's going to be a set of recovery packages coming down the line. Your governments are willing to, you know, do things that they're not otherwise willing to do. You don't have government suddenly saying, collectively, let's spend 10 trillion here. But actually, it's kind of the order of magnitude required to start to address the climate challenge. It's in the trillions. And so, I think you're right. Momentum has been paused. Let me say paused rather than lost. And as we emerge from this lockdown, I think we'll have learned some valuable lessons actually about how we, if we fail to prepare, we're preparing to fail. And, we've failed here in some sense. And, let's not fail on the climate side as well.
I do hope we're not going to fail on that side, but thank you so much for answering on that. And there's another question that I would like to pose to you, because as you guys talked in the beginning about, the let's say positive effects that we see from COVID-19 coming on the climate, as in, we see the pretty pictures that Alina mentioned. We see things that you showed us in the slide that you had of, reduced traffic emissions, etc., etc. There's the question, do you know of any negative effects on the climate? So, and an example is, for example, more packaging waste, right? Because there is more that we get delivered, people ordering in more, etc.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in the data, but it wouldn't surprise me that some forms of waste will have risen. I mean, other forms will have fallen because just simple, the sheer amount of consumption going on in the economy has fallen as well. So there'll be a lot of these kind of very short run, this is positive, that's negative. And in a sense, I'm less focused on that than I am about the big picture of getting the problem solved. And for me, the most negative consequence that could come of this is that we don't take the lesson that actually we need to be investing in the clean technologies of the future. And if this ends up taking funds away from that area, which I don't think it will, by the way, but if it were to do that, that would be a problem. Because what we're seeing here is just how hard it is for us to reduce our emissions through behavior change. Now, I have lots of colleagues who work on behavior change, and they do very important things. And in a way, what we've got here is a kind of a moment where we can reset habits. It's probably a habit discontinuity, I think it's called. And that's very important. But the flip side is that I don't think we all want to be living like this, for 5 or 10 years into the future. And even as it is, we don't have our emissions down at zero. This is not a solution. So for me, what's really important is that we take, not focus on these short-term ups and downs, but take the lesson from this, that we've got to get our technology sorted. And we can't leave ourselves in a situation where, the scientists are saying a pandemic's coming. It starts and logic tells you what's going to happen. And we ignore it until suddenly, oh, we got a problem here. I wish we'd taken that seriously 5 years ago. And, pandemics and climate are in the same kind of bucket of problem. They both involve what economists call global public goods. And, there's important lessons, frankly, from one to the other that we can draw. So we need to draw those lessons.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll be back with more questions later.
Thanks.
Thank you, Reka.
Thank you, Reka.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an so your title says environmental economist. I want to focus a bit on the economist side as well, because me as an entrepreneur, I'm trying to figure out the repercussions of this crisis on a global scale. I'm sort of privileged because I run a software company, so we can switch to remote work. Our customers are spread globally, so it's not one market that we're particularly tied to, but still it affects everyone. And I'm looking at 12, 18, 36 months down the road. I'm trying to figure out where the silver linings are in this tragedy. Sorry. So how do you see how big of an economic collapse are we looking at?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. There's been a lot of speculation already. It'll continue, I suspect. I mean, a few months ago, you had some people saying this is one that's a little V-shaped recovery. We'll be back to normal in 3 months. I think it's dawned on people that this is bigger than that now. And the bottom line is that you will start to see a proper pickup in economic activity and a return to some kind of normality once either we have a large-scale deployment of a vaccine, or once we've built up what the epidemiologists describe as herd immunity, which means you've had a large enough proportion of the population have COVID, the disease, and develop the immunity to it. Now, you could build up that herd immunity just by having everybody get infected, but the problem with that is that a small proportion of those people will need to go to hospital, and another proportion of those people will need ventilators to survive. So the speed at which you can do that is a function of the capacity of your healthcare system. And the way I read the numbers, although I'm not an expert, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm just reading. I've read, like everybody else, read more epidemiology than in the last couple of months than I have in my entire career. But the way I look at that suggests that this is, it's not 3 months, it's longer than that. It might be 6 months if we can expand the capacity of health services pretty quickly. If we can't, it could be over 12 months. But I don't think it's 3 years. Famous last words, you should never, but it shouldn't be that long. And then the question is, so economically, what are we left with at that point? How many businesses like yours have survived, I hope, and how many businesses have gone under? And can we design the package of policies to keep solvency throughout the economy while we're kind of spinning our wheels a bit? Because the fundamental problem here is that you kind of don't want economic activity right now. It's that spreads the disease. So you have to shut it down. So I'm not sure what that fills you with joy or dread, Vlad, but that's how I see it.
I think it makes us more, all of us, more conscious of the fact how brittle everything is, and also looking at the real pillars of economy and society in general, and what holds the infrastructure that holds everything together. Mm-hmm. But maybe to switch back to climate, and on the level also. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question that I really need to ask you, Cameron. So I want to talk about the European Green Deal. I mean, there was this big plan that by 2050, where each EU member state will have taken care of their carbon emissions and will be neutral. But as this entire Corona conversation and discourse has risen, there are many countries like Poland, for example, who declare that and claim that, okay, we don't have the capacities right now to follow green policies. We have to take care of our economy. We have to rebuild our economy. And this rebuilding, the recovery, won't be green. What's your take on that? Is it an excuse now, or can we recover the economy by implementing green policies?
Well, it's definitely a case of the latter. It's not just can we must, and we almost certainly will, at least to some extent. And the reason for that is that if you think about where the big opportunities for job creation and infrastructure investment, all the sorts of things that you need after a crisis to get the economy back going again, the biggest item on the agenda is transitioning the energy system, transport system, the industrial system, the food and agricultural system. All these systems need to be reworked, rewired, reshaped. And it costs a lot of money, it creates a lot of jobs, leaves us much better off afterwards. I mean, the returns on these investments are huge. This is a very sensible thing to do, economically speaking. Mm-hmm. So in actual fact, pushing on with the Green Deal, whether it's the European Green Deal or Green Deals across the world, is exactly the right kind of response. You know, once we've dealt with the immediate kind of need to rescue firms and citizens and the economy, when you're into rebuild mode, that's exactly what we should be doing. Now, you've referred to our friends in Poland. I mean, the Poles are, for very understandable reasons, in a tricky spot here. They have a historical legacy of a lot of coal. They've got their coal domestically. There are deep historical and cultural reasons that we need not go into here as to why it's been harder for them to rely on their neighbors to decarbonize. And I'm not sure that this pandemic has radically changed the situation in Poland. The positives for the Polish economy are that, like every other economy on the planet, they have strong supplies of renewable energy, because there's just vastly more renewable energy everywhere than we could use, than we need. So the way is open for them to have a to move to a much cleaner economy, and I'm pretty sure they'll get there.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned industries, right? For me, one of the thoughts that I had, that we actually had a conversation recently about aviation, and so many challenges that this entire aviation structure is facing right now. So what if in the near future we start setting onto train infrastructure and different ways of public transport that maybe is less harmful to the environment? Do you think that is a valid thought, or are we just way too optimistic right here?
Well, I mean, if I'm being really realistic, I think that people will still be wary of traveling in enclosed spaces with lots of other people for some time, and I suspect that kind of long distance travel will probably fall. Not least because more of us are finding out that actually using these digital methods of engaging, they're not the same as being face to face, but they're pretty good. So I think those industries are never, they're not going to kind of come straight back up to the trajectory that they were on, but they'll return. And then the question is, so in what form can and should they return? So if you're bailing out an aviation industry in a country right now, do you just chuck them a lot of cash and say, get on with it, guys? Or do you take the opportunity to think, well, we know this industry has to transform itself pretty radically in the next decade. They've got their own targets as an industry, which is no additional growth in emissions, even as probably the industry expands. But I think it's reasonable, if you're putting an awful lot of public money into an industry, that you ask what's appropriate to request of that industry at the same time. So, I'm not saying outrageous things, but reasonable things like perhaps you should increase the percentage of sustainable fuels, whether they're biofuels or synthetic fuels made by taking CO2 out of the air, or alternative fuels like perhaps ammonia, or even a shift to electric planes for some short haul travel. All of these things are plausible. They're on the horizon. Some of them even kind of happening in small measures now. So, rather than simply bail out an industry like aviation, no questions asked, have a bit of a think about how we can help. And if you look at what happened in the financial crisis with Detroit, bailing out the old car industry, no questions asked, was not really a winning strategy. Luckily for America, Tesla came along, and it's an American car company, but the Chinese have a large electric car industry too. So I don't think you do your national industry any favors by simply throwing them money.
Right. So what you're saying, like, the opportunity here is to like rethink the old ways and take a step back. But I mean, historically, you've said it yourself, other crises have shown us that the first instinct is to salvage what is there, is to salvage the old economy, the old way of thinking, and it probably needs to have another order of magnitude or a prolonged time to get to the second stage where you start to rethink. So are you optimistic about it? Like personally?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think we learned a lot in the last financial crisis about how to do a recovery package. Now, this crisis is different, clearly, in a number of ways. But some of those lessons are helpful. And in a sense, the climate challenge is now more obvious, more urgent. More people are aware of it, as we were just saying with Rebecca. It's got a lot of momentum. And it also helps solve this problem. You know, as I'm saying, addressing climate actually helps us to pull ourselves out of what could be what my doctoral student Brian O'Callaghan calls a pan-session, a pandemic-induced recession, I guess, is his language. So if we're in this pan-session, you know, a great way of getting out of it would be to press ahead with the Green Deal.
Okay, pan-session. That's the first day I haven't heard it before.
I hadn't heard it either, so credit to Brian.
Hashtag pan-session. One other issue about Corona is that it is a global threat. It is, as a pandemic, it affects us all. It seems to us, I mean, it doesn't only seem to us, it's a fact that the response to it, although it's a global threat, has been on a national level. So far, at least. I mean, there is cooperation, there are institutions, health organizations, and so forth, but still responses vary, and it's on a national level. And so how come that, and in comparison to the climate crisis, is also a global challenge, right? And the measures have been also different, and also on national levels. What is your opinion on the Corona crisis being regulated on a supranational policy level?
Yeah, right. I mean, as you say, we've got the World Health Organization, the WHO, at the international level, and that enables sharing of information and sharing of experiences and learning by example and so on. And we don't have a global government. And for all of these global public goods problems like pandemics, like climate change, you know, there's some sense in which having a global government would make it easier, but we don't have one. We're probably unlikely to get one anytime soon. And there are very sensible people who point out that having such an entity would come with drawbacks as well, potentially to, you know, to individual liberties. So it's not obvious or clear cut that you'd want an entity kind of far away dictating what locally should be done. But what you do definitely want and need for these global public goods problems is an awful lot of cooperation, and the means for whatever entities we have, nation states, corporations, regional governments, you know, local communities, to join up and to see the collective interest in cooperating, and to realize that we really are all connected. I mean, if this virus teaches us anything, it's that we are properly all connected to each other. So, you know, you've just got to, we've got to work together, or we're fried in the climate space, and we've got to work together in the virus case, or we're literally dead. So, yeah, I'm not sure that looking for a global government is the answer. Certainly strengthening global institutions is very much required on the cards, or at least it should be on the cards. And Vlad, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, the retreat into nationalism is, I think, a product of all of these stressful situations is that they bring out the best and the worst in humans. And, you know, the racism, the nationalism is the worst, but the courage and the bravery and the kindness and the compassion that you see, you know, that comes out at times of pressure as well. And obviously it's there that we need to be, you know, need to be amplifying the best of humanity.
So, I mean, the last time we saw each other was at the About Time conference, and I have a time-related question. And that would be in the context of urgency and preparedness of both of these crises. So in the context of the Corona crisis, let me rephrase it. 1 week for the Corona crisis might be a year or even a decade for the climate change crisis. What can we learn from the urgency of the one for combating the other one?
Yeah, well, what we learned from the coronavirus crisis is that when we put our minds to it, we can act fast, big, trillions, major changes to behavior, major disruption. We've decided to do that because it's obvious that it's needed. Now, the climate emergency is actually a bigger emergency it's way bigger. It's just not right now, as you say. I mean, the impacts are already happening. They're starting to come through. I'm Australian, we've been on fire over there. There've been floods in different parts of the world, etc. So, but that's just the beginning. So one lesson I take is that we can act if we realize that it's urgent. Another lesson that I take is that it's urgent now to act because we're in a mess on the virus, but we could have acted years ago and we didn't. So, you can take a very negative message away from this, which is that humanity will only ever get its act together when the crisis is right on top of us. But we're not completely dumb at the same time. We do have a habit of learning. Not always, but my hope at least is that this kind of crisis will teach us that we just can't sit around and wait until it's too late on the climate side, because as I say, the impacts will be way, way bigger. If you think this isn't bad enough, just fast forward 30 years if we haven't taken action on climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the message is that we as a global society need sort of this, or at least have historically needed this common threat to act together, and cooperatively move forward against or towards a solution for these issues. So we can do the same thing for climate change. Thank you, Cameron. Thanks a lot for joining us. Any like final message you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think that there's an awful lot to learn from this crisis, the virus crisis, and then apply it to the climate crisis. So we're interconnected. You can't separate yourself from the rest of humanity. If you don't prepare, we'll be in a mess. And actually, the thing to really take home is that the way out of the COVID crisis may well just be to actually get on the path to solving the climate crisis, because the two things, we can really solve both problems in terms of the recovery post-virus in the one set of policy measures. And if we do that, then we'll have recovered what we can of the existing economy after the virus has swept through it, and we'll put ourselves on a pathway to not being in such a mess next time. So I think that's the message I'd leave everybody with, that we're in a time of upheaval and change. Old assumptions have gone out the window, but we're also teaching ourselves that when we really put our minds to it, we can do big things together. And I think at the end of this, when the virus is moved through and we're trying to rebuild the economy, let's rebuild it in a way that puts us on a path to net zero emissions. That's an extremely positive message to leave everyone with.
We still have another question of Reka, I think.
Okay.
So maybe we should have her join her again.
Yep.
Hi guys, I'm not sure I want to come in now. You just left us with such a positive note, Cameron. And the things I wanted to follow up on was, on the one hand, just a very tiny question to, when we talked about the green goals, you were talking about the economy and how, maybe governments could also pose some green goals, kind of like something that they would have to reach if they are funded now and are being helped by the government. We saw it in Austria. It was very fast of, telling the companies that if you get support now, then your shareholders are not going to get dividends for the next year. So something similar to this, you know, of if you support you now in the crisis, these are the things that you can reach. And you already mentioned one example. Do you have other examples for that? What, you know, the government could maybe request in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think so if you divide the response into two phases, there's a kind of a rescue phase for the economy and then a recovery phase, you know, once hopefully we've built up some immunity or a vaccine's in place. So for the rescue, I think by and large, this is just about making sure businesses have the cash to operate, not go out of action. And you know, in a number of very polluting industries like aviation or, you know, the power industry, you know, you wouldn't, that doesn't actually need rescuing, but, you know, fossil fuel, perhaps oil and gas industry, you know, do you really want to go and rescue a bunch of very high cost oil producers that can't make money at $60 a barrel when we know that for Paris alignment, your oil prices are probably more like they are, you know, today, in the sense we're in a dress rehearsal for a clean world with oil prices at $20 or $30 a barrel. So there's some industries you may not want to rescue at all, is what I'm saying, and think about you know, supporting at least those who are able to have a sustainable existence into the future. And for those who are currently heavy emitting, then, you know, we do need to keep them afloat, but do so in a way that shifts the trajectory of those industries. So if it's the steel industry that's going under, you know, perhaps we could be thinking about a rescue package that rescues the industry, but also puts them on a path to net zero emission steel, possibly using hydrogen, using direct reduction. If it's the transport industry that needs a rescue package, let's have a think about the proportion of electric vehicles in the fleet and so on. So I don't want to be too hard on these kind of you know, conditionality of the rescue, because the first and most important priority is the rescue. But then when you move into the recovery phase, that's a completely different story. You know, let's make that a full-on, fully fledged green recovery. That's where we want to go.
I love how you put that, like really, you know, separate to going, okay, we first need to rescue you. Here's what you need to do that. Like, here's all the money you need to be rescued, but then let's also look at the recovery. So I think, you know, if more people like you, more experts like you could also advise the government on how to do the recovery phase, that would be amazing. And the second question I just wanted to follow up with, and then again, maybe we find a positive note here as well to end it off, is you talked about, we talked a lot about urgency. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think, how can we put that sense of emergency that Alina talked about into the climate crisis? So, you know, we don't always feel overwhelmed, because obviously right now we're feeling that this COVID crisis is very overwhelming for a lot of people, also mentally. So obviously we don't want to go from one crisis into the next crisis. I think we humans need to recover as well. But how can we keep that sense of urgency for that topic as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important, because urgency is a big motivator, as we've seen in this case. It's difficult because if something is big in a year's time, it's trumped by something that's less big tomorrow. That is just kind of human nature. I think the way of doing this is probably, you know, not through the set of arts and tools that I command as a scholar and an academic. It's through what you guys do better, which is appealing to the heart and to the emotion with visuals and with reality, making sure that people are aware of climate impacts where and when they happen. You know, not exaggerating them. That's certainly something that we're not keen on at Oxford, but accurately and honestly portraying the powerful truths that are out there about the scale of the impacts already being felt, and just bringing that home to people that it is already an emergency. And then, you know, maybe there's a little analogy here. So, you know, why has this virus been so difficult? Well, it's because there's this gap in time between when you get it and when you start having symptoms, and you're infectious in that little bit in between. And that little gap, you know, you kind of locked in damage before you realize that it's going to hit you. And it's the same on climate. You know, we're locking, it's like we're infectious now, but we haven't seen the full set of symptoms. We're just starting to get a bit of a headache, you know, and we're not lying on our deathbed, unable to breathe. But that's the logic. That's where it goes. Unless you read the signs, you look ahead and you think, oh, I better get myself to hospital. So look, you know, I'm gonna leave it to you and to the student movement to work out how you build the real urgency that's there, how we kind of get ourselves into the headspace of actually, I know it's not going to happen for a while, but unless we act now, we're screwed then, to use a technical term. That's where we need to go.
I thought it was a beautiful analogy. I will keep using that. I hope that's okay with you. I always quote you.
Credit.
Of course. Thank you so much, Cameron. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Rekha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rekha. Yes, so on that note, I mean, we have so many takeaways. I think the way you beautifully put it, that this recovery phase is where the opportunity lies, to look ahead, to rethink how certain industries work, to rethink how certain business models are set up. It is something where like a silver lining in all this mess. Yeah,
and I mean, let's not diminish the human misery that we're seeing now, but once we're into that recovery phase, it could be very exciting. It's a chance to rebuild and to do it better this time around, and I think we'll seize that chance.
Thank you for your
so much,
wise
Cameron.
words, your expertise, and your optimism.
My pleasure.
Stay safe and healthy. Bye.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining, Cameron. Have a great evening and a great weekend.
Thanks, Alina. You have a nice weekend too. Bye,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.
Hey, we have been muted.
We were muted, so maybe to quickly rephrase that, what I mentioned is that the title of today's session, right, was how a virus can potentially heal our planet. Maybe it's not the virus that will teach us, it's the price that we're paying right now as a society and as an economy that will teach us how to heal the planet eventually.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities. I mean, the tragedy is bigger by the day. There is an increasing body count that is sort of played out globally. I mean, we're always trying in these calls and discussions that we have, and beyond them, the discussions that we have between us, to find ways in how to cope with it, first of all, but also trying to see opportunities and rethinking old ways of doing, rethinking how we see the world and how we act personally, individually, but then also in our local community, in our society as a whole, in economy and business. So there are tons of opportunities here, and if it teaches us one thing, is that if done correctly, global cooperation can be of immense impact. So with that being said,
with that being said, may I jump in?
Yes.
Would like to give you a little outlook on next week. So next week will be taken over by our co-host Rekha, and we'll jump in with the community questions, and we really hope that next time we'll manage to have the live stream on Facebook. But we'll have very exciting topics coming up. So we will have Sarah E. Hill, who many of you might remember from her talk at 2019's About Time. And we will talk about her with about how to juggle home office and homeschooling. So we'll have a great conversation about education, parenthood, and childhood in the context of the coronavirus. And after that, we'll have a very interesting guest, Carolina Milborn. So we'll talk about journalism, news, and how the media are acting right now upon the challenge of informing us, non-informing us, and we'll have most probably more questions than answers. But and I think we're both very much looking forward to next week.
All three of us, and hopefully also you. And Corinna, just as a big shout out, has been a speaker at TEDx Vienna in 2011. That's way back, and we're looking forward to welcoming her again. And hopefully also you. So tune in next time. Join us for our dinner with lunch, breakfast, whatever you're having, a snack in between.
And stay home and stay safe. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.